Hello, AP and CCP U.S. history students. Mr. V coming to you today to talk to you about Manifest Destiny and the Mexican War. Now, Manifest Destiny is the providence of God. Okay, this idea that by expanding west, we were given the territory out west specifically by God, whether it be by promise, by some sort of biblical understanding, whatever the case may be. It was used as a justification for us to move west past the Mississippi River and start to try and expand the United States from sea to shining sea. Of course, there were some people that were against such movement, but most Americans were on board with this in some way, shape, or form. We use it, of course, as justification for not just seizing land, but also doing some pretty underhanded things diplomatically and certainly some terrible things to Native Americans along the way. So this is not just something that happens in isolation during the 1830s and 40s. This is going to have major ramifications, not just when the Civil War comes around in the 1860s, but also after the Civil War as we start to move further and further west and we start building trains to connect our nation east to west. This is, of course, part of Henry Clay's vision of where we're headed when he starts the American system. And it certainly is part of the vision of John C. Calhoun as they start to expand out, trying to find new territories for slaves. This is going to be driving the whole push westward. Is the idea is that we need more territory with which to expand, not just for us personally, but to expand the institution of slavery, which is going to be a whole new subset of problems. In case you've ever wondered, why is it that the founding fathers basically had said slavery was something we'll talk about another day, and then it rears its other ugly head later? It's because they had kind of learned to live with the institution. Both North and South had benefited economically from the late 1700s to early 1800s because of slavery, as cotton becomes king and the cotton gin starts to become more and more of a driving force within slave economy. Manifest Destiny ends up becoming kind of the push to make sure that we can expand the cotton trade and by extension slavery. And that's when it starts to really ruffle feathers and gain some traction as an abolitionist movement in the North because of that. And of course, we'll talk about that when we talk about the reformers tomorrow. But the Manifest Destiny idea is something that catches on because of a push, not just to have economic expansion and geographic expansion, but expansion of institutions like slavery, which is why slavery becomes more of a polarizing and divisive issue throughout the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So again, Manifest Destiny really kind of starts, if you want to get technical, during the time period of John Tyler. Now, as we ended yesterday, we talked about how William Henry Harrison had become president and then died 31 days in because of pneumonia. When he dies, John Tyler takes over as president of the United States. Now, John Tyler is a former Jacksonian Democrat who only left the Democrats because he thought Jackson went too far. He basically didn't believe that Jackson had the right to institute things like the Force Bill and the Trail of Tears. While he wasn't necessarily opposed to Indian removal, and while he wasn't necessarily opposed to a president doing his job, he was opposed to the nationalist tendencies of Jackson. He was more of a states' rights advocate, very much in favor of Virginia's right to rule themselves. So in actuality, John Tyler is a Jeffersonian Democrat. And when Jackson kind of skews the party to be more nationalistic and kind of embrace some of the former standards of the Federalist Party, John Tyler is not on board with that. So he leaves the party and joins up with the Whigs. The Whigs kind of like the idea of pairing up John Tyler, who has been in government before, who has governmental experience, both in Virginia and in the national government, with William Henry Harrison, who has only been a general and has never really understood how Washington politics work. Even though he's been a governor of a territory, so he has been an executive, Harrison really doesn't understand how the systems of government work, so they think it'll be good to have Tyler right there to try and guide him. At no point did they think that Tyler was going to be president of the United States. He was just there to be an advisor more than anything else. They probably should have thought that, though, because at the time, Harrison was the oldest person we ever elected. He was in his late 60s. He was in failing health, and pneumonia took him pretty quickly. So this should have been at least some form of a concern at the time. But needless to say, Harrison dies. Tyler takes over. Now, Tyler taking over, is this something that is in the Constitution? Because when Harrison dies, everybody kind of turns to the Constitution and says, well, what happens now? If you remember when we were talking about the Constitution, technically speaking, the Article 2 of the Constitution was left pretty vague. And they basically just kind of said, well, we'll let Washington kind of figure it out. Washington's the first president. We'll trust him to do what's right. He's always kind of guided us the right direction before. And so he was the precedent president. But Washington left office and allowed an election to decide who came next. So Adams taking over as the second president was done via election. We had not had a president die. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Martin Van Buren had all made it through their time in office. Harrison's death comes at a time where we're not sure what happens. So John Tyler takes it upon himself, and he just takes the oath of office. And when people say, is that how it's done? He's already done it. He's basically just decided that that's how the Constitution works. And everybody just kind of goes along with it. So this idea now that we have that, if Donald Trump were to be removed from office, that Mike Pence would just automatically take over. That's because of the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment solidified this whole thing. But Tyler's the one that kind of established it. Tyler, basically there was no election. There was no, act of Congress. There was none of that. He just took the oath of office, and that's just how it happened. So Tyler kind of sets that precedent that the vice president is literally one heartbeat away from the presidency. It was always kind of assumed, but nobody really knew if that's what the Constitution said. Needless to say, when he takes over, he is not exactly trusted by most Whigs. Being the fact that he was a former Democrat and had Jeffersonian tendencies, the Whigs really didn't trust him as the president. And they kind of called him nasty names. They called him his accidency because he just was an accidental president, as it's known. And they really didn't like him, too. They even called him at one point the executive ass because he constantly was doing things to undermine Whig ideals. The Whigs would pass something through Congress. Henry Clay would champion something that would be part of his American system, or John C. Calhoun would champion some sort of tariff maneuver, or Daniel Webster would kind of put forth some sort of bill that was dealing with some sort of financial reform. And Tyler, almost to a point, would undermine it at every step of the term and veto things. So he became kind of Sir Veto. He was this guy in charge that would just veto anything he didn't like. And he didn't like a lot of the Whig tendencies because while he identified as a Whig, he didn't really truly believe in what they were doing. So not surprisingly, when the Whigs take over and think, oh, well, Harrison's going to be president, so let's pass, for example, a new Bank of the United States to replace the absolute failing institutions of Jackson and Van Buren. When they had gotten rid of the second Bank of the United States and caused the Panic of 1837, they're like, let's put a bank back in. Tyler vetoes it. They try and override it. It doesn't happen. So Tyler basically becomes a bulwark against anything that is going to go against what Jackson did while he was in office. So even though Tyler doesn't particularly care for Jackson, he seemingly is agreeing with a lot of Democratic principles when he comes in. The Whigs they rebel against him. They can't stand this, so he becomes a man without a party. He's somebody that is distrusted by the Democrats because he had turned his back and walked to the other side, and now is hated by the Whigs because anything they want to do, he overrules. So not surprisingly, when they put a tariff bill in to try and change the tariff and maybe kind of whittle it down even farther, he vetoes it. When they say, well, wait a minute, we want this veto we want this tariff because we need some protective tariffs against other foreign competing powers, Tyler says, well, but that's not the point of a tariff. A tariff is to raise revenue. It is not to protect industries. So again, it's very Jacksonian in his mentality and very Democratic in his mentality. So the Whigs don't ever seem to get him to understand that they have a vision of what America needs to be, and he's kind of going against it. Well, not surprisingly, when there are issues with Great Britain, Tyler's going to be very contrarian, very controversial in how he handles it as well. Believe it or not, the entire cabinet that was put in place by Harrison leaves office in protest. They are so disgusted with Tyler that they all resign. The only person that stays on is Daniel Webster, who had risen to the rank of Secretary of State. Secretary of State, the only reason he stays is because he's dealing with Great Britain, and he feels like if he leaves, they're going to, all these negotiations and all the things he's been working for are going to fall apart. Well, what is he basically trying to accomplish? There's a lot of anti-British feelings. If you remember yesterday, I told you that Canada was in rebellion during the time of Martin Van Buren's presidency, and we had stayed out of it. The British kind of appreciated that, but there were still questions about who controlled the Great Lakes. And for those of you that forgot about the Great Lakes here, there are five Great Lakes that spell out Homes, Homes. Okay, so Huron, which is right here on the east coast of Michigan, Ontario, right above New York, Michigan over here on the west side of Michigan. Okay, E is Erie over here, and Superior's up above what is today Minnesota and Wisconsin. So Lake Superior up there. So Homes. That's how you kind of remember it. But you'll notice that that is kind of the four of these lakes are going to form the border between modern day Canada and the United States. But that is not absolutely for sure. At this point, Wisconsin is still a territory, so is Iowa, Minnesota. All of these areas are still very much in flux, very much open for debate. And if you remember, John Quincy Adams had already established the idea that we were going to have a border that didn't have any sort of weapons or military buildup or a wall or anything like that. We had very good relations with not only the Canadians, but the English government that was running their territory. So when that all occurs, Webster basically wants to solidify that agreement and that relationship. And so they start working to better their financial situations. And then when the Canadian Rebellion of 1837 starts going on, we pretty much stay out of it, which is very controversial because, again, the Canadians are rebelling against a colonial power. Because we don't step up, there's a lot of criticism that we left the Canadians to kind of fight this on their own. What kind of a democracy are we? What kind of a republic are we if we don't step up for somebody that's trying to get the same type of government that we have, especially when they're a neighbor? But we didn't want to upset the British. Now, this almost comes to a head during the Creole incident. The Creole incident happens in 1841 when a slave ship, which is basically trading slaves. The international slave trading was done, but this was a ship that was basically trading slaves between territories. So internationally, no, but territories and states were still allowed to trade slaves. Well, the Creole was a ship that was basically transporting slaves. It was hijacked by the slaves. And basically, they forced this slave master. They basically said, you're going to take us back to Africa. They wanted to go to a place called Liberia. Okay, Liberia had been set up as a location in Africa for freed American slaves. Okay, Liberty, Liberia, and the capital city was Monrovia because it was set up during Monroe's time in office. Okay, they wanted to go there. The captain of the ship said there's just not enough food, not enough water to actually make that trip. So they chose to go to the Bahamas. They knew if they went back to the United States, they would be put back into slavery. So they went to a British port at Nassau in the Bahamas. The reason, in 1833, the British had declared that slavery was illegal in the British Empire. So they knew if they got to British territory, they would technically be free, as long as they were accepted by the British. Well, when they got to Nassau, the British actually accepted them in. They did arrest the 15 ringleaders of the slave insurrection on the ship as mutineers to try them, put them on trial, if you will. They eventually released them anyway. Only a few slaves actually chose to go back to the United States, and they went right back into slavery. I think it was like 3 decided to go back, but 128 stayed in the Bahamas and had their freedom. Now, that ends up being the largest successful slave insurrection in American history. There were other slave insurrections. There was, of course, Nat Turner, which we'll get to here when we talk about reformers. There was Gabriel. There was the Stoner Rebellion. All these different rebellions historically that dealt with slaves, but those were not successful. The ringleaders ended up being executed, and while they had momentary gains from time to time, most of the time they ended in pretty much failure to get their freedom and accomplish their goals. The Creole incident, this was very successful. They ended up getting their freedom. Now, when that occurs, Tyler is furious with this. Being a Virginian, being a slave owner himself, he's generally opposed to this, and he tries to get the British to basically apologize for getting involved in American beliefs and policies and whatever else. The thing is, Webster is not on the same page with him. So just like Tyler had been undermining Congress, Webster's kind of going to undermine the Tyler administration by still negotiating and coming up with what is known as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. So they kind of put that all aside. They don't worry about the financial woe and the Canadian Rebellion, and they don't worry about the Creole incident. All he's trying to do is say what is controlled by the United States. And so they solidify this northern border. They handle the northern border of what is today Maine and solve what was known as the Aroostook War, which was literally a war between lumberjacks, which just sounds comical, but apparently it was really bloody and nasty. And of course, you don't want guys with axes throwing axes at each other, So needless to say, they had to settle the northern border of Maine, and they had to settle the small little territory of what is today Minnesota. But they also settled the border along the Great Lakes. They basically split 4 of the Great Lakes in half. They said, half of the lake will be Canadian water, and the other half will be American. The only one that was completely and totally American is Lake Michigan, because it dips down between what is today Wisconsin and Michigan. So that becomes American water, but the other 4 end up being divided. And that was all handled by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which pretty much calms any sort of disagreement we have with the British, which is good because we're going to have a major disagreement with them over Oregon later on. Needless to say, there are other issues during Tyler's time of office. They don't know what to do with Texas. All the way through the tail end of Jackson's presidency, the entirety of Martin Van Buren's presidency, and now into Harrison and Tyler's time in the White House, there's been questions about what to do with Texas. Texas has become its own republic. Mexico has basically accused the United States of influencing them, of helping them, of aiding them. And to a certain degree, they're not wrong. But the American government has never, ever once said, we're helping them so that we can absorb them into the United States. Even though Texas had asked to be admitted or annexed to the United States, that had never happened. And all the way through this, there's some tension between Mexico and Texas. Texas had gotten their independence, but Santa Anna, the leader of Mexico, had basically said that he had signed the treaty that released Texas as a territory. He signed that under duress. He had been captured on the battlefield, and he said that wasn't a legitimate treaty, because a treaty is where 2 governments come together and they negotiate and they sit down and come up with compromise. He basically said that he had been forced, that he had been coerced to sign this deal that he felt was unfair and did not reflect the overall war, meaning, he had been kind of kicking the tail of the Texans, and it was just that one battle where it went bad at San Jacinto. And he basically makes the argument, hey, I signed that under duress after one of the only bright spots for the Texans. That's not really a fair assessment of the border. That's not a fair assessment of territory that is owned. It's certainly not a fair assessment of what we're going to do with the United States or any other country that gets involved. So it's becoming more and more of a problem, and it doesn't help that the British are also getting involved in Texas. They're also starting to court Texas as as a trade partner, and there's a real concern, especially in the South, because Texas makes cotton and England is using cotton at a fairly large rate. There's a concern that Texas will undercut the Southern American states of, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, places like that, and that the English will only turn to Texas to get their cotton, or at least try and drive the prices down from that competition. And of course, the Americans want to get involved in that, but how in the world do you get involved without possibly violating some sort of treaty you have with the Mexicans, or just annexing and just violating it entirely? And Mexico is not exactly happy with this either, because they lost out on a very lucrative part of their empire. They lost out on not just territory, but economic advantages. And of course, they still believe Texas to be part of their country. This is not going to be solved anytime soon. And Tyler is going to violate everything, because when he's leaving office, after he He does not get nominated by the Whigs to run for election. He's not going to get reelected. He knows that, and of course, the Democrats aren't going to turn to him. So in 1844, as he is leaving, basically the candidates that are running to replace him start coming up with all manner of promises of here's what we're going to do. And of course, who's running? Well, the Whigs nominate Henry Clay. The lovable loser comes out again. And now the Democrats have to answer. Now, the Democrats have been trying so hard to find an heir apparent to Andrew Jackson. And there's a whole host of names that they're going through. They're trying to find some candidate that's going to rise to the occasion and really kind of show the way, if you will. And, a bunch of very prominent people are passed over because in the end, they turned to a what is known as a dark horse candidate, somebody that nobody really expects to come out. And it's the former governor of Tennessee, not surprisingly, Tennessee, and the protege of Andrew Jackson. They turned to James K. Polk. So James K. Polk runs against Henry Clay. And of course, as you know, I've told you, Clay never wins the presidency. So Polk, out of nowhere, wins the presidency. Now, why? It's because there's growing problems with Texas, where we don't know what to do with that. And there are growing problems with Oregon. Oregon, as a territory, had already kind of been maneuvered by John Quincy Adams into being an argument over just two countries. The British claimed the area up here, what is today British Columbia, and some other territories up towards the Yukon Territory, all the way up to what is today Alaska. They had kind of taken this territory, but they also claimed the territory that is nowadays considered the states of Washington and Oregon. The Americans claimed the exact opposite. We claimed what is today Washington and Oregon, but we also claimed some territory in British Columbia as well. So there were overlapping claims. Okay. The problem is in the Treaty of 1818, we had agreed not to even bother with this. We're going to leave this alone for about 20 years. Well, now it's coming due. Now we got to figure out what to do. And keep in mind, we had kind of shortchanged the Spanish. We had basically kind of swindled them out of that territory. The Spanish had made claims there too. We had kind of outmaneuvered them. And the Russians had made claims, but we had outmaneuvered them as well because of John Quincy Adams wheeling and dealing in treaties. So now it's just down to who's going to own this between the British and the Americans. And the dispute is coming to a head now. And you started hearing phrases like 54-40 or fight, which was the idea that if we are going to take the territory, we are going to take all this territory right here, okay, all the way up to the line that up here says 54 degrees, up here, 54-40, if you will, okay, which is a line of latitude, okay, and this is the extreme U.S. claim. And 54-40 or fight meant we are going to go all the way up to that line of latitude, and we're not going to settle for any 1 mile of it less. We're going to take that entire territory. And there were people who were willing to fight. Polk didn't really want to go that far, but he is going to go along with it during the actual election because, again, he wants to be president of the United States. So not surprisingly, 1844's election becomes a mandate on Manifest Destiny. Do we want to expand or not? Henry Clay is very much against annexing Texas. He doesn't want to do that. He's against getting into a big shouting match with the British. He wants to negotiate. Not surprisingly, Clay wants to compromise. James K. Polk doesn't want to. He wants to take the military and let's take it for a spin. Now, Polk never really comes out and says, I want to take Texas. But he doesn't exactly close the door. He doesn't say that, I want to take Oregon, but he does say very fishy things like, I want the United States in my presidency to go from one ocean to the other. So he wants to go from sea to shining sea. Well, how else is he going to do that if he doesn't take Oregon? He's kind of giving a window into his soul here that if he's not going after Oregon, then he'd have to find another way. And that other way would be a place called California. So Polk pretty much plays his hand. He opens up his hand and says, this is what I'm willing to do as president. So this really does come down to, do you want Manifest Destiny or do you want a compromise candidate like Henry Clay? Not surprisingly, the issue of the election is that. Do you want to expand or not? The election results of 1844 are conclusive. As you can see, Polk And look, Clay and Polk, it's pretty split down the middle if you look at it, on the popular vote. But again, as we've said before, elections are not won in the popular vote. It's the Electoral College. And as you can see, Polk in blue here takes the solid South, takes the Western territories, the Western frontier states, who are obviously more on board with Manifest Destiny. But curiously, he takes Virginia, he takes Pennsylvania, he takes New York, and he, of course, takes this area up here. Now, why this area up here? Because they had just settled the Aroostook War. So these policies of expansion and military involvement are going to be popular with people that are on the periphery who are concerned about Native American problems, concerned about the British, concerned about any number of problems. And of course, the people down in the South are concerned about a Mexican invasion as well. So all of that is fine and dandy. They're going for that. Now, why do people in the center here go for Clay? And notice that even Tennessee, Polk's home state, doesn't go for Polk. Okay, Polk is not exactly popular in his home state. Jackson's policies were starting to fall off in Tennessee. They were more agrarian, and they were starting to say, hey, if we expand, that means more territory out west to produce cotton. So Tennessee's argument, as well as North Carolina, is aren't you actually going against your better interest by adding territory? Isn't that actually going to hurt you in the long run? So, of course, this is becoming more of a sectionalization of the country as well, where you got some states arguing one thing, other states arguing another, and they're completely polar opposites. Needless to say, Polk wins the presidency, and Polk comes in. He's a different kind of character. Now, he is, as I said, a protege of Andrew Jackson, but that doesn't mean that he's like Jackson in all manner of speaking. He's not a violent tendency guy. He doesn't lose his cool very easily. He's actually quite a reserved guy. He is a workaholic. He works 20 hours a day. He doesn't sit still. He is somebody that doesn't like to delegate anything. So even though he's got a cabinet, even though he has government officials, he doesn't delegate any tasks to them, because he kind of views that if something's going to get done, it's going to, if you want it done right, it's got to be done by me. So Polk basically works himself to death. He promises that he's only going to be a one-term president, and he is right on that. He leaves the presidency after only one term, and it's probably good because he ends up dying a year and a half later. He basically exhausts himself from being president. Now, why does he do that? Because he has very big visions about what the country is going to be. So his objectives are quite simple. He wants to go from sea to shining sea. He wants the Atlantic and the Pacific to be connected by a landmass that is all under one flag. So he is going to want to take Texas. He is going to want to take Oregon, and he's going to want to take California in some way, shape, or form. Now, Texas is easy because Tyler, as a parting gift, annexes Texas. He basically says, as he's leaving office, and I'm going to add on Texas. So Polk is kind of put in a position as he's coming into office. He's got to deal with Mexico. Mexico's upset. Polk, of course, can overrule this if he wants to. He chooses not to. He says, look, Tyler's already started it. Who am I to say no? And so he does a very Jacksonian thing where he just kind of sweeps into office and says, Texas is now ours. Now, of course, is the Mexican government going to be upset? Yes, but Polk's kind of counting on that because it's part of his long-range game plan. If Mexico attacks, if Mexico causes a war, well, now we can use our military to now take more territory. And again, if his goal is to get California, he doesn't want to be the aggressive nation. It would be so much easier if Santa Anna were to attack us. So he's very obvious in where he's headed with his objectives here. He wants territory. He's going to be the Manifest Destiny guy. Now, out of all the presidents of this time period, he's probably the most successful because of that, because he's got a clear-cut vision and he's going to follow through on it. Now, you may not agree with his vision, and you certainly may not agree with his methods of how he's going to get it, and whether or not his accomplishments are a success. That doesn't matter to Polk. Polk is not concerned about his legacy. He's not concerned about how people view him. He's a one-term president that just wants to get some stuff done. Not surprisingly, he negotiates with Great Britain, manages to get Britain to settle on the current northern border. Basically, what they do is they just take the northern border of what is today Montana, and they just continue it out to the Pacific coast. So by settling the Oregon question, he immediately accomplishes the goal of stretching from sea to shining sea. but he's not done, because the reaction is that we kind of gave up. And there are some people thinking that 54-40 or fight, that we could have probably taken more territory if we wanted. Were the British really going to fight for that territory of what is now British Columbia? Polk kind of takes the argument of, I don't want to fight the British when I can fight the Mexican government and get more. So he's kind of playing that hand, if you will. So not surprisingly, when Mexico kind of sees that we have taken Texas, they start to make claims about where their territory ends. And they have disputed territory. They believe that the Rio Grande is not the southern border. We do. The Rio Grande is what we think, that river is the southern border of the United States, now that we have taken in Texas. They believe that the Nueces River, which is a little north of that, the Nueces River is actually up here. Okay, the Nueces River on the north side of this green territory on the map, whereas the Rio Grande's down here. Okay, now they're having arguments over this. Mexico is not only upset about this, they're upset about the fact that Americans are starting to settle out here. They're starting to go out into this territory that is on the map Mexico still. They are going out to what is today California and settling. And Mexico knows that that is how Texas, fell. They allowed Americans to settle, and then the Americans got too comfortable and they declared their independence. So they are concerned that California is going to do the same thing. They are concerned about unpaid debts, that there were debts that the Americans and specifically the Texans owed to the Mexican government for land purchases, for farming subsidies, for taxes, whatever, that there were some Texans that owed debt to Mexican creditors. Well, when we annexed Texas into the United States, Mexico says, well, that debt is now yours and you have to pay it. And the United States government is not willing to do it. So they have another misunderstanding. And then, of course, again, the southern border of Texas is certainly in flux. So when that occurs, Santa Anna basically makes some threats. So we move an army down to the southern border. The problem is we go to where we believe the southern border. We go down to the Rio Grande, because we are going to enforce our claim that disputed territory is ours. So a guy named Zachary Taylor, the general in the army, takes his soldiers down to the southern border to guard the river. He makes a claim that a Mexican army shot at them. He makes the claim that, hey, they were the aggressors. They shot at us. There are questions as to whether or not Zach Taylor was on the right side of the river when he was shot at, and there are questions as to whether or not the Mexican army actually shot at them. We'll never know the answer to that question, but there was a little-known congressman in 1846 and 1847 who started to ask questions about this. So when the Mexican War starts to really fire up and we start reacting with the idea that we have to go down and kick the Mexicans out of that territory and win the Mexican War, as it ends up becoming known, this little known congressman, this one-term congressman, a Whig from Illinois, stands up in Congress and says, I would gladly support this war. I would gladly support this military incursion if you could merely show me the spot on the map where this battle took place, where Taylor says he got shot at. And it's a challenge to Polk and his presidency to point out, if you can show me where it is on this map, and it is in the disputed territory or in American territory, then I'll support the war. But if it's anywhere but that, then we are the aggressors and we are in the wrong. This congressman ends up losing all kinds of support, and he ends up getting a really nasty little nickname of Spotty Lincoln. And he only serves one term. And yes, that's right, it's Abraham Lincoln. He only serves one term. He basically gets voted out. The people of Illinois get very upset at him because he wasn't very patriotic. And there are even people that say this is not the type of leader that you turn to in times of war. A highly ironic statement later on, but at this point, he's viewed as almost un-American. And he basically retires from politics at that point. He kind of believes that he's pretty much done. So he goes back and becomes a small town lawyer in Illinois. Little do we know that 12 years later, he's going to be elected the president of the United States. That's a story for a different day. Bottom line is we're involved in the Mexican War. The actual war ends up being a real rear end kicking. Santa Anna is not ready to fight this war. He gets basically called out of exile to come back and lead his troops. The Mexicans basically turn to him in times of crisis. and he's not ready. His army's not ready. And the army of Zachary Taylor invades from the north. We send an army south, basically by water, to land on the Yucatan Peninsula and start marching in against against Mexico City under a guy named Winfield Scott. And Winfield Scott, a War of 1812 general, a guy that had risen to prominence and fame during that, even gets more famous during this time period. So both Taylor and Winfield Scott are going to end up becoming heroes of the war, and not surprisingly, they're going to be recruited by the Whigs to run for president, both of them. Why? They realize that their ticket to the presidency is to have a Whig, have a general be their candidate. Okay, again, another story for later. Bottom line is they master Mexico. Mexico cannot fight back. We capture their capital city, and that's not to say that it wasn't hard pitched battles from here and there, but Mexico pretty much falls. Now, the bigger issue or the bigger fallout from the Mexican War, aside from the fact that we are going to take a ton of territory, is weirdly enough, this becomes a breeding ground for the eventual Civil War in the United States. Most of the household names from the Civil War fought in the Mexican War, whether it be Grant, whether it be Lee, Jackson, all these guys that are going to rise to prominence as generals during the Civil War are lower level lieutenants and captains and whatever else during the Mexican conflict. Okay. Of course, in the end, what ends up happening, America basically fights for peace. This is what they basically are arguing, that we're in reality, we're fighting to kind of spread our peaceful existence across the continent and be a beacon of righteousness for the rest of the world, which is a load of garbage, but the propaganda works. We signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the Mexican government pretty much has to cede what is today the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California to the United States. We take that territory in, and notice, where is that territory? Predominantly it is in the South, and it would be below the Missouri Compromise line from 1820. So we basically took new slave territory. Now, again, the results of the war, we end up accomplishing what Polk wanted: sea to shining sea, and a pretty solid sea to shining sea at that point. But it's also going to have a lot of economic impacts too, because now, how do you link East and West? How do you start to develop that territory? What's out there? What benefits is this going to have? Are these even settle? Can you settle there? Can you even grow cotton or tobacco or whatever else in these locations? We're now going to have to figure that out. Now, the controversial thing that came out of this is, if we have new Southern territory, do they admit slaves? Because the Mexican government, it used to be Mexican territory, mind you, the Mexican government had outlawed slavery. They had said that territory cannot be full of slaves. So there were no slaves in that territory. There are people that are going to start saying, well, that is free soil. We won it, but it is free soil. You can't have slaves there. Now, the Southerners under Calhoun and the rest are going to say, yes, we can. We took it, and now we're redefining it and redeploying it as slave territory. That is the crux of the argument over slavery that will feed the Civil War down the line. Now, it's of course shown in basically 1847, 48, when the Wilmot Proviso comes up in Congress. David Wilmot from Pennsylvania puts out a proviso that basically says all of the land that we took from the Mexican War, anything we took from the Mexican War, is going to be considered free territory. That he basically says we're not going to allow slavery to expand to that territory, which is a very free soil type mentality. It gets shot down in Congress. It doesn't pass, but it causes a general rift in the Congress, and it starts a sectionalization of the United States, where the North starts to say, you know what, Wilmot was right. We shouldn't have territory out west that has slavery if it didn't already exist there, which they have a right to say, because that's how the Northwest Territory was settled as well. There was no slavery in Ohio, in Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, or Wisconsin, because again, the slavery did not exist there prior to. So when territory came in where slavery didn't exist, we had precedent to say then the states that came out of that were also free as well. The South is going to say, yeah, but we settled that dispute with the Missouri Compromise line. Now the precedent is that anything below that line is now slave territory. So this is going to be the crux of the argument. Wilmot kind of proves that this is the start. and really the germination of the modern slavery controversy. Now, Wilmot isn't exactly a righteous human being. In reality, the reason he wrote that is because he realized that a lot of slaves were running to the north on the Underground Railroad during this time period. Harriet Tubman and her followers were rescuing people in the South and moving them north. Well, he didn't want black people in Pennsylvania. He didn't want escaped slaves coming to Pennsylvania. Instead, if you have free territory out west like New Mexico and Arizona, they now could run west. That means the black people could go out that direction and not towards us. So Wilmot really does kind of have this mentality of, I don't want blacks to live here. So this is kind of the germination of the modern racist, mentality. There's a lot of racist feelings in this. So it's not exactly a completely, benevolent action by David Wilmot as much as it is, I don't want him living here. Okay. The overall results of Manifest Destiny, we do expand. So Polk ends up becoming a widely considered a very successful president. But at what cost? Because we did gain the territory, it renews this struggle over slavery and bolsters a growing movement of reformers like abolitionists that are tired of the institution, tired of the excuses, don't believe it to be an economic necessity of the United States and want to move past it. Because as much as the founders like Jefferson and Washington said that slavery was wrong and they should end it, they couldn't at the time, but they saw the writing on the wall that slavery was soon going to end. The problem is they didn't see that the cotton gin would make cotton king and necessitate a large workforce where slaves could thrive and prosper, or slave owners could thrive and prosper, I should say, with slave labor. So there are unintended consequences to all this. Manifest Destiny is merely going to highlight those sectional imbalances and those arguments. And that's going to become the crux of the Civil War. Like I said, the guys that fight in the Mexican War are primed to then fight in the Civil War just 12 short years later. By that same token, the Civil War is going to happen 12 years later over the arguments that are born during this struggle, whether it be the Mexican War, whether it be accepting Texas, negotiating for Oregon, settling the disputed territory between Canada and the United States, whatever the case may be, everything that we do during this time period is going to alienate the regional differences and the sectional differences of the United States. And we have switched now to where it's no longer East versus West as much as it is North versus South. And that is kind of what drives us to the Civil War. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about reformers. We're going to talk about people that are making American society different during the antebellum. And a reminder, antebellum means before the war. So it's the time period before the Civil War where we start to argue about how society should look and what beneficial reform looks like within our American society. If you have any questions, certainly reach out through email or office hours. Otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy.